I was standing in the middle of a grand ballroom surrounded by 372 guests in custom gowns and tailored tuxedos, when my own mother grabbed the microphone and demanded the keys to my $15 million Manhattan penthouse as a wedding gift for my sister. When I said no, she slapped me so hard, my diamond earring flew across the marble floor. I did not cry. I simply picked up my earring, walked out the door, and made a single phone call. 60 minutes later, the man they feared most walked into that reception, and the screaming began. My name is Aaliyah, and I am 29 years old. Until that particular Tuesday evening, I had spent my entire adult life building a fortress of financial security to protect myself from the very people who were supposed to be my family. The air inside the luxury hotel ballroom was thick with the scent of imported white roses and expensive champagne. My younger sister Jasmine was celebrating her marriage to Preston, a man whose family claimed to be Boston old money. From the moment the engagement was announced, my mother Yvonne had been in a state of frantic social climbing. She viewed this wedding not as a celebration of love, but as a corporate merger that would finally elevate our family into the elite white circles she had always idolized. She spent the entire evening trailing after Preston and his relatives, laughing too loudly at their mediocre jokes and ignoring the subtle condescension in their eyes. I sat at a table near the back, nursing a single glass of sparkling water and watching the performance with quiet detachment. As a self-made hedge fund manager, I had learned long ago how to read a room and read the people in it. Preston was not the wealthy aristocrat he pretended to be. I could see it in the slight fraying at the cuffs of his rented tuxedo, and the way his eyes tracked the expensive jewelry worn by the other guests. But my mother was too blinded by her own ambition to notice the warning signs. She was entirely focused on impressing a room full of people who would never truly accept her. The live jazz band was playing a smooth melody when the music suddenly ground to a halt. The screech of microphone feedback echoed through the cavernous space, causing several guests to cover their ears. I looked toward the stage and saw my mother standing there, her silk designer dress shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. She tapped the microphone twice, demanding absolute silence from the crowd. Her face was flushed with champagne and triumph. She began a long, winding speech about the importance of family legacy and the beautiful union of two prestigious bloodlines. I listened with growing unease, knowing my mother never took a public stage without a hidden agenda. She spoke about Jasmine, painting her as the perfect, obedient daughter who deserved the absolute best the world had to offer. Then her eyes scanned the crowd and locked directly onto me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as she smiled, a cold, calculating smile that I recognized from my childhood. She raised her glass and spoke directly to me through the sound system. "We all know that marriage is about establishing a foundation," she said, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "Jasmine and Preston are starting a beautiful new chapter together, and they need a home that reflects their new social standing. A small starter home simply will not do for a family of their caliber." She paused, letting the silence stretch out to build the dramatic tension. "That is why I am so thrilled to announce that Aaliyah has generously decided to gift the newlyweds the keys to her penthouse in Manhattan. She is single and focused solely on her career, so she certainly does not need all that space to herself. Family always takes care of family, and Aaliyah knows how crucial it is for Jasmine to live in a neighborhood that meets the high standards of Preston and his wonderful parents." The entire ballroom erupted into polite applause and excited murmurs. 372 pairs of eyes shifted from the stage to my table in the back. The sheer audacity of the ambush left me momentarily breathless. My mother had deliberately chosen a public setting filled with high society guests to trap me. She calculated that the social pressure of being the supportive older sister would force me to comply and hand over a property I had worked 80-hour weeks for 5 years to purchase. She wanted to use my hard-earned wealth to buy her way into the favor of Preston and his family. The applause began to die down as people waited for my reaction. Jasmine stood near the front of the stage, beaming with entitlement, her hands clasped together in mock gratitude. Preston stood beside her, wearing a smug, arrogant expression that told me he was fully aware of this plan. I slowly set my glass down on the crisp white tablecloth. I pushed my chair back and stood up, feeling the heavy weight of their expectations bearing down on me. But I was no longer the frightened teenager they used to control. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I simply looked at my mother and spoke loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear and for the whispers to carry my words to the front of the room. "No." The word cut through the remaining applause like a blade. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. My mother lowered the microphone, her smile freezing into a grimace. "I beg your pardon," she asked, her tone shifting from celebratory to dangerous. "I said no," I repeated, maintaining my calm demeanor. "I am not giving my home to a grown woman who refuses to work and a man who claims to come from infinite wealth." I turned my attention to Preston, ensuring my voice carried clearly across the quiet room. "If your family is as rich and powerful as you have been bragging about all evening, Preston, why exactly are you begging a black woman for free real estate? If you cannot afford to buy your wife a house, you have no business marrying her." The collective gasp from the audience was audible. Several of Preston's relatives turned red with indignation, while others whispered furiously among themselves. Preston dropped his smug smile, his face contorting with immediate defensive rage. My mother practically threw the microphone onto the stage and marched down the steps. Her high heels clicked violently against the marble floor as she closed the distance between us. The guests parted like the Red Sea, clearing a path for her fury. She stopped just inches from my face, her chest heaving with exertion. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for me and the closest bystanders. "How dare you embarrass me in front of these people? You are ruining your sister life." "I am simply refusing to fund her delusion," I replied, refusing to break eye contact. "You cannot ambush me in public and expect me to surrender my property to save your face. You do not have the power over me anymore." The air between us crackled with years of unspoken resentment. My mother raised her hand and swung it with all the strength she possessed. The slap landed squarely on my right cheek. The sharp crack echoed through the silent ballroom, causing several guests to cry out in shock. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side. The heavy diamond earring I wore caught the brunt of the impact, tore loose from its backing, and flew across the polished floor, coming to rest near the edge of the dance floor. A burning sensation spread across my skin, but I kept my breathing steady. I did not raise a hand to touch my face. I slowly turned my head back to look at her. "You are nothing but a dark-skinned disappointment," my mother sneered, her true feelings finally spilling out for the world to witness. "You have always been too aggressive, too independent, and too full of yourself. You think your money makes you special, but you will never have what Jasmine has. You will never fit into these circles. You owe this family everything you have." "I owed you nothing," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. "Every dollar I have I earned myself, despite your constant theft. Have you forgotten what you did when I was 18? Have you forgotten how you drained my college savings account? The money I worked 3 jobs to save just so you could buy Jasmine a luxury car for her high school graduation. You left me with nothing. You forced me to take out predatory loans and sleep in my car during my first semester of college while Jasmine drove around in a brand new convertible that she crashed 6 months later. You stole my foundation to fund her vanity. You do not get to claim you gave me anything." My mother took a step back, momentarily thrown off balance by the public exposure of her past crimes. Several guests near our table were openly staring now, their expressions shifting from shock to absolute disgust. But my father, Calvin, suddenly appeared, pushing his way through the crowd to stand beside his wife. He pointed a thick finger at my face. "You shut your mouth right now, Lila," he commanded, his voice booming with forced authority. "You are embarrassing this family. You will hand over those keys, or I will personally see to it that you are completely cut off from the family trust. I will disown you right here and now." The threat of being disowned by my father would have terrified me a decade ago. Now it only fueled the fire of my resolve. "You cannot cut me off from a trust that does not exist, Calvin," I said, dropping the title of father. "We both know your construction business has been failing for years. You are drowning in debt, and the only reason your company did not go completely bankrupt last month is because my hedge fund anonymously bought out your largest creditor to keep you afloat. I own your debt. I own you." My father's face drained of color. His hand fell to his side as he stared at me in disbelief. Before he could formulate a response, Preston stepped into the circle. He puffed out his chest, attempting to assert dominance over the situation. "Listen here, Layla," he said, using a condescending tone that dripped with arrogance. "You need to calm down and know your place. You are acting like a typical angry woman, and it is frankly pathetic. Jasmine is my wife now, and if my mother-in-law says you need to contribute to our future, you will comply. You should be honored that my family is even associating with yours. Do not push your luck." I looked Preston up and down, taking in his cheap suit and unearned confidence. I slowly walked past him, ignoring his blustering completely. I walked over to the edge of the dance floor, bent down, and retrieved my diamond earring. I brushed the dust from the glittering stone and slipped it into my clutch purse. I turned back to face the four of them, my mother, my father, my sister, and her new husband, all of them standing together, united by their greed and their shared delusion. You wanted a public spectacle, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the silence. You wanted to play games with my property and my life. Consider this my wedding gift to you all. You have exactly 1 hour to enjoy this little fantasy. I promise you by the end of tonight, you will beg me for the very same mercy you refused to show me. I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. The guests scrambled out of my way, refusing to meet my eyes. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung shut behind me, cutting off the tense silence of the reception. I walked down the long carpeted hallway of the hotel until I reached the grand entrance. The crisp night air hit my face, cooling the stinging warmth where my mother had struck me. The valet rushed forward to retrieve my car, but I held up a hand, asking for a moment. I stood under the glowing lights of the hotel marquee, pulled my phone from my purse, and dialed the only number that mattered tonight. The line rang twice before a deep, calm voice answered. "Yes, Lila. Desmond," I said, leaning against the stone pillar of the entrance. "It is time." They crossed the line. "Kicked the hornet nest, did they?" he asked, a hint of dark amusement in his voice. Mother slapped me in front of everyone and demanded my home. Father threatened to disown me from the fake trust, and the groom decided to put me in my place. I took a deep breath, letting the final remnants of my familial loyalty evaporate into the cold air. Bring Grandmother Ruby files, bring the true will, bring the financial dossiers on Preston and his bankrupt family. I want you to initiate the foreclosure on Calvin House and notify the authorities about the $5 million Yvonne embezzled last week. I want the complete destruction of their entire illusion. And Desmond, make sure you bring the federal agents. A dark chuckle came through the receiver. I will be there in 60 minutes, Layla. Wait in your car. When I walk through those doors, the empire they built on your suffering will burn to the ground. I ended the call and walked toward my waiting vehicle. The night was just beginning, and the true celebration was about to commence. The grand mahogany doors at the very back of the ballroom burst open with a deafening crash that echoed heavily over the silent crowd. The thick, solid wood slammed violently against the walls, rattling the expensive crystal sconces and instantly snapping every single head in the room toward the main entrance. 3 men stepped over the threshold, moving with a synchronized and terrifying precision that completely altered the festive atmosphere of the wedding reception. In the center walked Desmond, looking absolutely immaculate in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that fit his tall frame perfectly. His silver hair was perfectly cut, and his expression was colder than absolute zero. Flanking him on either side were 2 massive private investigators, whose bulging suit jackets made it very clear they were heavily armed and fully prepared for any physical altercation that might occur. The 372 elite guests practically climbed over each other to clear a wide and immediate path down the center aisle. The complete silence in the massive room was only broken by the heavy, imposing thud of their footsteps advancing steadily toward the main stage. My mother. Yvonne turned toward the sudden commotion, and all the blood instantly drained from her carefully contoured face. The delicate crystal champagne flute she was holding slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered into 100 jagged pieces against the polished marble floor. The sharp sound of the breaking glass seemed to break her temporary paralysis. She stumbled backward, awkwardly grabbing blindly at Preston's arm for physical support as her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. "You cannot be here!" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical and desperate frequency that pierced the quiet room like a siren. "You were officially disbarred 5 years ago. You belong in a federal prison for what you did to this family and this business." She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at his chest and turned her frantic gaze toward the useless hotel security guards who were standing nervously near the edge of the stage. "Get him out of my daughter reception right now!" she demanded, her chest heaving violently as she began to visibly hyperventilate. "Arrest him for criminal trespassing and throw him out into the street where he belongs." Desmond did not even break his measured and confident stride. He walked straight up the stairs to the main stage and easily stepped past the hotel security guards, who wisely decided to back away from the 2 imposing armed investigators. He reached the wooden podium and calmly pulled the microphone from its heavy metal stand. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, taking his time before looking down at my mother with a smile completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. My disbarment was officially overturned yesterday morning by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he announced, his deep and authoritative voice projecting effortlessly across the vast room. They finally found the hidden offshore bank accounts you used to pay off those fake witnesses, Yvonne. I am fully reinstated by the State Board, and I am standing here tonight as the sole legal executor of the late Ruby estate. The wealthy guests gasped collectively as the massive gravity of his sudden words settled over the room. Desmond looked out at the sea of shocked faces, taking his time and ensuring every single person heard the absolute truth about the real estate empire they were currently drinking to. 5 years ago, Calvin and Yvonne maliciously framed me for corporate embezzlement, he explained, keeping his tone incredibly surgical and precise. They fabricated complex financial records and paid off corrupt city auditors to silence my voice because I was the only person standing between their greed and the true legacy of this family. Grandma Ruby did not build a $60 million real estate empire from nothing, just so two greedy and foolish individuals could squander it all on country club memberships and fake high society weddings. She built her enormous wealth brick by heavy brick during the civil rights era. She fought violently against illegal redlining and systemic racial discrimination to secure commercial properties that empowered our entire community when no traditional bank would lend a single dollar to us. She was a brilliant and powerful titan who completely despised superficial vanity, and she saw right through your pathetic and desperate facade, Yvonne. She knew you were nothing but a shallow social climber, willing to sell your own soul and betray your own daughter for a temporary seat at a white country club. And she knew perfectly well that Calvin was entirely too incompetent to manage a simple lemonade stand, let alone a massive commercial property portfolio. They had to completely destroy my life and my legal career to get access to the money because I was the lawyer sworn to protect her actual final wishes. Calvin let out a feral roar of pure agonizing humiliation. The fragile facade of the polished and wealthy patriarch completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate and cornered animal. He lunged forcefully off the stage, throwing his heavy body directly at Desmond in a violent attempt to physically silence the man who was actively destroying his entire life. He raised his fists high, aiming straight for Desmond's face while screaming a string of incoherent and desperate threats. He never even made it past the very first step. The two private investigators moved with blinding speed and ruthless physical efficiency. They intercepted my father mid-air, grabbing his flailing arms and slamming him face first onto the polished wooden floor of the stage with a sickening thud. Calvin grunted in agonizing pain as they pinned his arms tightly behind his back, pressing a heavy knee firmly between his shoulder blades to keep him completely immobilized. He thrashed and kicked wildly, cursing violently and spitting onto the expensive floor. But the investigators held him down easily as if he weighed nothing. Preston decided this was his perfect moment to step up and play the heroic white savior for his new wealthy family. He puffed out his chest and marched over to the investigators, completely misreading the harsh and dangerous reality of the situation. He tried to use his perceived racial privilege and fake old money status to take immediate control of the room. "Unhand my father-in-law right this instant," Preston barked, pointing a commanding and trembling finger at the armed men. "Do you have any idea who my family is, or who you are dealing with right now? I demand you release him immediately, and show some proper respect before I make a single phone call, and have you both thrown in a dark jail cell for aggravated assault." The professional investigators did not even blink at the empty and pathetic threats spilling from Preston's mouth. They kept Calvin pinned firmly to the floor, ignoring the arrogant groom completely as if he were nothing more than a buzzing and irrelevant insect. Desmond slowly turned his cold gaze toward Preston and let out a soft, dismissive chuckle that echoed loudly through the microphone. "You have absolutely no power or influence here, little boy," Desmond said, his voice laced with heavy and undeniable disdain. "Save your pathetic theatrical performance for someone who does not have your real financial records sitting inside a leather briefcase." Preston swallowed hard, his arrogant posture instantly deflating at the direct mention of his hidden finances. Desmond stepped away from the wooden podium and slowly unlatched his heavy leather briefcase resting on the edge of the stage. He reached inside, carefully navigating the dense stacks of legal paperwork and court orders. The entire room held its collective breath in pure anticipation as he pulled his hand out and held an item high up in the air for everyone to clearly see. It was a large, thick manila envelope secured tightly with a heavy red wax seal bearing my grandmother's personal antique stamp. The wax was completely solid and unbroken, proving it had been untouched for 5 long years. "This is the true will," Desmond announced. Desmond held the thick manila envelope high above his head, letting the heavy red wax seal catch the bright light of the massive crystal chandeliers. The entire ballroom remained locked in a suffocating silence as he slowly broke the antique seal. The sharp tearing sound of the thick paper echoed loudly through the massive space. He pulled out a crisp stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. My mother, Yvonne, let out a low, whimpering sound from the front of the stage, watching her entire fake reality crumble into dust right before her eyes. Desmond adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked directly at the crowd of 372 elite guests. He began reading the official legal declarations in a loud and booming voice that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation or doubt. "I, Ruby Josephine Caldwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke any and all previous wills, codicils, and testamentary dispositions." Desmond paused, letting the heavy legal language settle over the room before delivering the fatal blow. "I leave absolutely nothing to my son Calvin or his wife Yvonne. They have proven themselves to be morally bankrupt and entirely driven by superficial vanity. I leave 0 assets, 0 properties, and 0 financial support to my granddaughter Jasmine, who has been molded into a shallow reflection of her mother." The wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the brutal honesty of my grandmother echoed through the elegant venue. Desmond turned the heavy page of the document and continued reading the exact terms of my true inheritance. "The entirety of my $60 million real estate empire, including all commercial properties, residential holdings, and liquid financial accounts, is to be placed into an irrevocable blind trust. The sole and exclusive beneficiary of this trust is my resilient and brilliant granddaughter, Aaliyah, who carries the true spirit of our ancestors." Desmond lowered the paper slightly and looked directly at me with a proud gleam in his dark eyes. "The terms of this trust dictate that the assets are to be fully released to Aaliyah upon her 29th birthday, or in the event that her parents attempt to extort, steal, or otherwise manipulate her personal property." My mother gasped loudly, clutching her chest, as she realized her very own actions tonight had triggered the final release clause of the trust. Grandma Ruby had known exactly who they were. She had anticipated their relentless greed and built a flawless legal cage to protect my future. "The sprawling mansion in the prestigious historical district where Calvin and Yvonne currently reside is also included in this transfer of ownership." Desmond read aloud, projecting his voice toward the back of the room. "That property now belongs entirely to Aaliyah." My father struggled weakly against the 2 private investigators who still had him pinned face down on the hard wooden floor of the stage. "You are lying." He spat out a thick line of blood forming on his lip where his face met the wood. "We have the legal will that passed probate 5 years ago. My mother gave us that house and the business accounts." Desmond stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at my father with utter disgust. "You have a forged piece of paper that you paid a corrupt city official to validate," Desmond corrected him, his voice carrying easily over the muted gasps of the audience. "When I refused to sign off on your fake documents, you panicked. You framed me for corporate embezzlement and used stolen company funds to bribe the local magistrate. You locked me in a federal holding cell and stole $60 million from your own daughter just so you could pretend to be a wealthy patriarch at the country club. The Federal Bureau of Investigation retrieved the original audio recordings of your bribery negotiations yesterday afternoon. Your fake will is completely void, and the federal indictments for massive inheritance fraud are currently being processed as we speak." The sheer scale of the deception sent shockwaves through the wedding reception. Several prominent guests pulled out their phones immediately, typing furious messages to their own lawyers to sever any business ties with my parents. Jasmine stood paralyzed near the front row, her expensive designer wedding dress suddenly looking like a cheap theatrical costume. The heavy realization that she was not a wealthy heiress finally crashed down upon her shoulders. She looked at our mother, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her trembling hands. "You lied to me," Jasmine shrieked, her perfectly contoured face twisting into an ugly mask of pure panic. "You told me I was inheriting half of the real estate empire. You told me I was going to be a multi-million-dollar socialite." She stomped her foot violently against the marble floor, acting like a petulant toddler who had just dropped her ice cream cone. "I cannot be broke. I am married to a man from a prestigious family. How am I supposed to afford the country club fees and my luxury lifestyle? You promised me I would never have to work a regular job. What about my honeymoon in Paris? What about my new car? She grabbed my mother by the shoulders and shook her violently, completely ignoring the fact that we were in front of hundreds of prominent guests who were recording the entire breakdown on their smartphones. Fix this right now, Jasmine demanded, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. Tell him the money belongs to me. I am the good daughter. I am the one who listens to you. You cannot let Aliyah take my money. My mother just wept louder, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence to comfort her golden child. The elaborate house of cards she had spent 30 years carefully building had completely collapsed in less than 10 minutes, leaving her with absolutely nothing but public humiliation. Preston stood a few feet away, watching the chaotic scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes. His smug, arrogant posture had completely vanished. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a live landmine. His chest began to heave as the reality of the financial destruction fully registered in his calculating mind. He looked at Calvin, still pinned to the floor by the armed investigators. He looked at the heavy mascara running down Yvonne's face as she cried. Then he looked at me, standing perfectly calm at the edge of the dance floor. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously against the tight collar of his rented tuxedo. I took 2 shaky steps toward the stage, holding his hands out in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Wait a minute," Preston said, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of his sudden realization. He looked directly down at my father, his eyes wide with impending dread. "If the real estate empire does not belong to you, and the trust is completely fake, then where did the money come from?" Calvin stopped struggling against the investigators and squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to answer the difficult question. Preston ran a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair, his panic escalating into genuine terror. "Answer me!" Calvin Preston yelled, completely abandoning the respectful tone he had used all evening to charm the guests. "If you are broke and the money was never yours, what about the $5 million you transferred to my family investment firm last week?" I watched Preston's face turn a sickly shade of pale gray as the terrifying reality of his own financial exposure finally hit him. He had spent the entire evening acting like the supreme ruler of the ballroom, ordering hotel staff around and mocking my existence, but now he looked like a cornered rat facing a predator. I decided it was time to put him out of his misery and completely dismantle the pathetic charade he had been playing since the day he first met my sister. I walked away from the edge of the dance floor and moved toward the center of the room. My heels clicked a slow and deliberate rhythm against the marble floor, echoing loudly in the suffocating silence of the reception. I stopped right next to Desmond and held out my hand. The tall lawyer reached into his heavy leather briefcase and handed me a thick black folder. I had spent the last 6 months meticulously compiling every single document inside it, tracking every hidden account and shell company. I gripped the heavy dossier and turned to face Preston directly. The crowd of 372 elite guests leaned forward in their seats, waiting to see how much deeper this massive scandal could possibly go. I did not need a microphone for my voice to carry across the dead silence of the room. I looked at the arrogant white groom who had tried to put me in my place just an hour earlier. I told him he should be very careful about asking where that $5 million came from, because the answer was going to destroy his entire life and send him straight to a federal holding cell. I opened the black folder and pulled out a thick stack of certified financial records, holding them high up in the air for everyone to clearly see. I told the crowd that Preston had been walking around all evening, pretending to be the sole heir to a massive Boston old money fortune, looking down on anyone who did not meet his absurd standards. I explained that his entire aristocratic persona was nothing but a complete fabrication built entirely on lies and severe crushing debt. His prestigious family investment firm had actually filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy over a decade ago, after several disastrous commercial real estate ventures completely failed. I read the exact numbers from the official documents detailing how they were currently drowning in millions of dollars of insurmountable liabilities. They were barely managing to keep up the fake appearance of wealth by taking out predatory high-interest loans and shuffling borrowed money between empty shell companies to fool their remaining investors. I held up the bank statements proving that his parents had leveraged their historical family home multiple times to pay off their mounting legal fees, until the bank finally foreclosed on the massive property last year. They were completely broke and absolutely desperate for any kind of financial bailout to save them from total ruin and public humiliation. That was the exact moment Preston decided to target my naive and hopelessly greedy mother. I looked down at Yvonne, who was still kneeling on the cold floor, sobbing into her hands as her perfect world crumbled. I explained to the horrified audience exactly how Preston operated his malicious scam. He knew my mother was deeply obsessed with high society assimilation and desperate for any form of racial climbing that would separate her from her roots. He purposefully attended specific charity galas to hunt for desperate social climbers who wanted proximity to whiteness and perceived historical prestige. When he met Yvonne, she immediately fell into his carefully laid trap without a single second thought. She started bragging loudly about the Caldwell Family Trust and our massive commercial real estate holdings to anyone who would listen, making herself the perfect target. Preston realized instantly that she was the wealthy mark he needed to save his family from absolute poverty and federal audits. He courted Jasmine not because he loved her or found her interesting, but because she was the easiest and most gullible access point to what he firmly believed was a $60 million fortune. Jasmine stood near the stage listening to my words as her mouth hung open in pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at the man she had just married, slowly realizing her entire fairy tale romance was nothing but a calculated financial transaction designed specifically to pay off his family debts. I turned my attention back to the black folder and pulled out a wire transfer receipt printed on official banking letterhead. I explained to the silent room exactly how far my mother was willing to go just to secure this fake prestigious marriage and impress her new white in-laws. Yvonne was so unbelievably desperate to lock down this upper-class son-in-law that she committed a massive federal crime without a single ounce of hesitation. When Preston told her his family firm needed a temporary bridge loan to clear a supposedly minor regulatory hurdle, she did not even ask for a formal contract or consult a lawyer. She secretly accessed the corporate accounts of my father's construction business using forged authorization codes she had demanded from his chief financial officer. She truly believed she was tapping into the endless well of the family trust to help her new favorite son secure his legacy. She wired $5 million directly into an offshore account controlled by Preston parents just to prove she belonged in his elite wealthy circles and could play their high-stakes games. She literally stole millions of dollars to buy a husband for her golden child and elevate her own pathetic social status in a community that secretly mocked her behind her back. I let that devastating information sink into the minds of the wealthy guests, watching the drama unfold before their very eyes. I explained that the money Yvonne embezzled was never actually hers to give away in the first place, regardless of her intentions. Because my father company was completely bankrupt, the funds she stole actually belonged to the corporate creditors who were preparing to liquidate his remaining assets. And since my hedge fund Apex Pay had secretly bought out all of that debt weeks ago, she had effectively stolen $5 million directly from my corporate holdings. She committed massive wire fraud to pay off a racist con artist who was using her own daughter as a human ATM machine to fund his lavish lifestyle. My father Calvin let out a loud agonizing groan from the floor where the private investigators still held him firmly down. He finally understood that his wife had just guaranteed them both a lengthy stay in federal prison because of her blinding obsession with social climbing and public perception. The sheer magnitude of the stupidity and criminal liability was enough to make his massive chest heave with genuine panic as he realized he had lost everything. Jasmine stumbled forward, her heavy designer wedding dress dragging awkwardly across the polished stone floor, making a soft scraping sound in the quiet room. She could not process the overwhelming magnitude of the lies surrounding her perfect wedding day and the destruction of her future. She reached out her trembling hands toward Preston, desperately needing him to deny the terrible things I had just revealed to the entire room. She begged him to tell everyone that I was lying, and that their love was genuine and untainted by money. She pleaded with him to say that his family was truly wealthy, and that they were still going to Paris for their luxury honeymoon in the morning just like they had planned. She took another unsteady step closer and tried to grab his arm for physical comfort and reassurance, hoping he would pull her into an embrace and protect her from the humiliation. Preston looked at her tear-stained face and ruined expensive makeup with absolutely no empathy or warmth in his eyes. He did not offer her a single word of comfort or attempt to deny any of my factual claims. Instead, he physically backed away from her, pulling his arm sharply out of her reach with a look of absolute visceral disgust on his face. Do not touch me! Preston spat, his voice dripping with sudden unrestrained venom. The polite and charming demeanor he had weaponized all evening evaporated completely, leaving behind the raw and ugly reality of a desperate con artist. He frantically wiped the sleeve of his tuxedo, where Jasmine had briefly grabbed him, acting as if her very touch had somehow contaminated his tailored clothing. He looked at the weeping bride standing before him and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut through the dead silence of the ballroom. "You honestly thought this was real?" he asked her, his tone loud enough for the hundreds of wealthy guests to hear every single cruel syllable. "You actually believed a man from my background would willingly tie himself to a family like yours without a massive financial incentive? You people are nothing but a loud, pathetic joke to everyone in my circle. We tolerate your desperate social climbing because you write the checks, but now you do not even have that." Jasmine stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend the brutal words tumbling from the mouth of the man she had just married. She shook her head slowly, her heavy veil slipping sideways across her shoulders. Preston did not offer her an ounce of mercy. He paced back and forth near the edge of the stage, pointing an accusing finger at my mother, who was still huddled on the floor. Yvonne bragged to anyone who would listen about the infinite wealth of the Caldwell Family Trust, Preston declared, pacing with manic energy. She practically threw her youngest daughter at me, wrapping her up in a nice little package with a $5 million bow, just so she could brag to her neighborhood friends about having a prestigious white son-in-law. Do you have any idea how exhausting it was to pretend I found your ghetto family dinners charming? I smiled through the loud arguments and the tacky displays of new money because I was promised a $60 million payout that would save my family legacy from total ruin. You people are not high society. You are a cheap, embarrassing imitation, and without that trust fund, you are absolutely worthless to me. The sheer volume of his cruelty echoed across the high ceilings of the hotel venue. Several guests gasped in shock at the blatant racism and classism he was now spewing without a shred of hesitation. Jasmine let out a piercing and guttural wail. The sound was ripped from the very bottom of her throat as the complete humiliation finally broke her mind. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the dance floor, the layers of her custom silk wedding gown billowing up around her shaking frame. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing so violently that her entire body trembled. Her perfect fairy tale wedding had been transformed into a public execution of her self-esteem. Preston looked down at her crying on the marble tiles and simply shook his head in supreme disgust. He reached down to his left hand and aggressively pulled the heavy gold wedding band from his finger. He did not gently place it down. He threw it as hard as he could. The heavy ring hit the nearest dinner table, bouncing off a crystal centerpiece and landing squarely inside a half-eaten plate of wedding cake. "I am done with this pathetic charity case," he announced, looking directly at me before glancing back down at his sobbing bride. "I am contacting my family lawyers the minute I walk out of this building to get this sham of a marriage annulled." What happened next was perhaps the most pathetic display of subservience I had ever witnessed in my 29 years of life. Instead of rushing forward to comfort her youngest child, who was currently having a massive emotional breakdown on the floor, my mother scrambled toward the man who had just verbally decimated her entire bloodline. Yvonne scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pieces of broken champagne glass scattered across the tiles. She reached out and grabbed the leg of Preston's trousers, looking up at him with wild and desperate eyes. "Please, Preston, do not do this," Yvonne begged, her voice cracking with pure pathetic desperation. "Do not leave her. We can fix this mess. I will find a way to get the money back. I promise you I will secure another loan or sell the remaining construction equipment. We are a good family. You cannot just walk away from us and ruin my daughter's reputation." She prioritized the validation of a racist white man over the basic dignity of her own child. She was willing to humiliate herself completely just to keep a fake status symbol in her family tree. Preston looked down at my mother, clutching his pant leg with absolute revulsion. He kicked his foot out sharply, dislodging her desperate grip and forcing her to fall backward onto the hard floor. "Get your hands off me, Yvonne," he snapped, smoothing his trousers. "You have absolutely nothing left to offer me. You stole money to buy me, and now you do not even have a house to sleep in tonight. You are completely bankrupt and facing federal prison time. My family will completely disavow any connection to you psychotic people by tomorrow morning." He turned his back on my mother and began scanning the room, looking for the quickest exit out of the grand ballroom before the situation deteriorated any further. The sheer lack of loyalty he displayed was breathtaking, but entirely expected from a man who built his life on financial scams and perceived racial superiority. Jasmine continued to scream and cry on the floor, begging her mother to make the nightmare stop while Yvonne remained frozen in shock at the violent rejection she had just received. The 372 elite guests were entirely paralyzed by the unfolding tragedy. Nobody dared to intervene or offer comfort. They just sat at their meticulously decorated tables, watching the golden family of their social circle tear each other apart with vicious abandon. The jazz band members had quietly packed their instruments and slipped out the side doors, wanting no part in the escalating chaos. Waiters holding trays of expensive appetizers stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, unsure if they should continue serving food to a crowd that was witnessing a financial execution. I stood calmly beside Desmond, taking in the complete destruction of my mother-manufactured reality. I felt no pity for Jasmine and no sympathy for Yvonne. They had built this fragile glass house using the bricks they had stolen from my future, and now they were bleeding from the very shards they had created. Desmond adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly toward me, keeping his voice low enough that only I could hear. He noted that Preston was likely trying to figure out how to escape the hotel without running into the federal authorities who were currently tracking his offshore bank accounts. I nodded slowly, watching the cowardly groom take a few hesitant steps toward the service hallway located behind the main stage. Before Preston could make a full retreat, my father finally snapped out of his stunned silence. Calvin had been watching his wife beg a younger man for mercy, and his favored daughter sob uncontrollably on the floor, while his own construction empire was legally seized. The overwhelming reality of his complete financial and social emasculation finally broke through his shock and ignited a blind, furious rage. He managed to push himself up onto his knees, ignoring the strict warnings of the two armed private investigators standing right above him. His face was a mask of pure, unhinged hostility as he realized his entire legacy was turning to ash. Calvin wiped a streak of blood from his chin and glared directly at me and Desmond. He refused to accept that he had been outsmarted by the daughter he had neglected and the lawyer he had framed. His massive ego demanded a final desperate attempt to regain control of a room that had entirely slipped from his grasp. "None of this matters!" Calvin yelled at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with exertion as he struggled against the grip of the investigators pulling him back down. He spat out a mouthful of blood onto the stage and stared at me with pure hatred. "You think you have won, Lila, because you bought out some bank loans and brought a disgraced lawyer to a wedding. You are nothing but a common criminal. I do not care what those forged trust documents say or what fake accounting tricks you pulled to steal my company. I am calling the police right now." He thrashed his shoulders, trying to reach into his suit pocket for his mobile phone. "I am having you and Desmond arrested for criminal trespassing and corporate espionage. You illegally hacked into my business accounts, and you are trespassing at a private event. You are going to spend the rest of your pathetic life in a prison cell for what you have done tonight." "Do not touch me!" Preston spat, his voice dripping with sudden, unrestrained venom. The polite and charming demeanor he had weaponized all evening evaporated completely, leaving behind the raw and ugly reality of a desperate con artist. He frantically wiped the sleeve of his tuxedo where Jasmine had briefly grabbed him, acting as if her very touch had somehow contaminated his tailored clothing. He looked at the weeping bride standing before him and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut through the dead silence of the ballroom. "You honestly thought this was real?" he asked her, his tone loud enough for the hundreds of wealthy guests to hear every single cruel syllable. "You actually believed a man from my background would willingly tie himself to a family like yours without a massive financial incentive? You people are nothing but a loud, pathetic joke to everyone in my circle. We tolerate your desperate social climbing because you write the checks, but now you do not even have that." Jasmine stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend the brutal words tumbling from the mouth of the man she had just married. She shook her head slowly, her heavy veil slipping sideways across her shoulders. Preston did not offer her an ounce of mercy. He paced back and forth near the edge of the stage, pointing an accusing finger at my mother, who was still huddled on the floor. Yvonne bragged to anyone who would listen about the infinite wealth of the Caldwell Family Trust, Preston declared, pacing with manic energy. She practically threw her youngest daughter at me, wrapping her up in a nice little package with a $5 million bow, just so she could brag to her neighborhood friends about having a prestigious white son-in-law. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it was to pretend I found your ghetto family dinners charming? I smiled through the loud arguments and the tacky displays of new money because I was promised a $60 million payout that would save my family legacy from total ruin. You people are not high society. You are a cheap, embarrassing imitation, and without that trust fund, you are absolutely worthless to me. The sheer volume of his cruelty echoed across the high ceilings of the hotel venue. Several guests gasped in shock at the blatant racism and classism he was now spewing without a shred of hesitation. Jasmine let out a piercing and guttural wail. The sound was ripped from the very bottom of her throat as the complete humiliation finally broke her mind. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the dance floor, the layers of her custom silk wedding gown billowing up around her shaking frame. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing so violently that her entire body trembled. Her perfect fairy tale wedding had been transformed into a public execution of her self-esteem. Preston looked down at her crying on the marble tiles and simply shook his head in supreme disgust. He reached down to his left hand and aggressively pulled the heavy gold wedding band from his finger. He did not gently place it down. He threw it as hard as he could. The heavy ring hit the nearest dinner table, bouncing off a crystal centerpiece and landing squarely inside a half-eaten plate of wedding cake. "I am done with this pathetic charity case," he announced, looking directly at me before glancing back down at his sobbing bride. "I am contacting my family lawyers the minute I walk out of this building to get this sham of a marriage annulled." What happened next was perhaps the most pathetic display of subservience I had ever witnessed in my 29 years of life. Instead of rushing forward to comfort her youngest child, who was currently having a massive emotional breakdown on the floor, my mother scrambled toward the man who had just verbally decimated her entire bloodline. Yvonne scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pieces of broken champagne glass scattered across the tiles. She reached out and grabbed the leg of Preston's trousers, looking up at him with wild and desperate eyes. "Please, Preston, do not do this," Yvonne begged, her voice cracking with pure pathetic desperation. "Do not leave her. We can fix this mess. I will find a way to get the money back. I promise you I will secure another loan or sell the remaining construction equipment. We are a good family. You cannot just walk away from us and ruin my daughter's reputation." She prioritized the validation of a racist white man over the basic dignity of her own child. She was willing to humiliate herself completely just to keep a fake status symbol in her family tree. Preston looked down at my mother, clutching his pant leg with absolute revulsion. He kicked his foot out sharply, dislodging her desperate grip and forcing her to fall backward onto the hard floor. "Get your hands off me, Yvonne," he snapped, smoothing his trousers. "You have absolutely nothing left to offer me. You stole money to buy me, and now you do not even have a house to sleep in tonight. You are completely bankrupt and facing federal prison time. My family will completely disavow any connection to you psychotic people by tomorrow morning." He turned his back on my mother and began scanning the room, looking for the quickest exit out of the grand ballroom before the situation deteriorated any further. The sheer lack of loyalty he displayed was breathtaking, but entirely expected from a man who built his life on financial scams and perceived racial superiority. Jasmine continued to scream and cry on the floor, begging her mother to make the nightmare stop, while Yvonne remained frozen in shock at the violent rejection she had just received. The 372 elite guests were entirely paralyzed by the unfolding tragedy. Nobody dared to intervene or offer comfort. They just sat at their meticulously decorated tables, watching the golden family of their social circle tear each other apart with vicious abandon. The jazz band members had quietly packed their instruments and slipped out the side doors, wanting no part in the escalating chaos. Waiters holding trays of expensive appetizers stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, unsure if they should continue serving food to a crowd that was witnessing a financial execution. I stood calmly beside Desmond, taking in the complete destruction of my mother-manufactured reality. I felt no pity for Jasmine and no sympathy for Yvonne. They had built this fragile glass house using the bricks they had stolen from my future, and now they were bleeding from the very shards they had created. Desmond adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly toward me, keeping his voice low enough that only I could hear. He noted that Preston was likely trying to figure out how to escape the hotel without running into the federal authorities, who were currently tracking his offshore bank accounts. I nodded slowly, watching the cowardly groom take a few hesitant steps toward the service hallway located behind the main stage. Before Preston could make a full retreat, my father finally snapped out of his stunned silence. Calvin had been watching his wife beg a younger man for mercy, and his favored daughter sob uncontrollably on the floor while his own construction empire was legally seized. The overwhelming reality of his complete financial and social emasculation finally broke through his shock and ignited a blind, furious rage. He managed to push himself up onto his knees, ignoring the strict warnings of the two armed private investigators standing right above him. His face was a mask of pure unhinged hostility as he realized his entire legacy was turning to ash. Calvin wiped a streak of blood from his chin and glared directly at me and Desmond. He refused to accept that he had been outsmarted by the daughter he had neglected and the lawyer he had framed. His massive ego demanded a final desperate attempt to regain control of a room that had entirely slipped from his grasp. "None of this matters!" Calvin yelled at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with exertion as he struggled against the grip of the investigators pulling him back down. He spat out a mouthful of blood onto the stage and stared at me with pure hatred. "You think you have won, Layla, because you bought out some bank loans and brought a disgraced lawyer to a wedding. You are nothing but a common criminal. I do not care what those forged trust documents say or what fake accounting tricks you pulled to steal my company. I am calling the police right now." He thrashed his shoulders, trying to reach into his suit pocket for his mobile phone. "I am having you and Desmond arrested for criminal trespassing and corporate espionage. You illegally hacked into my business accounts and you are trespassing at a private event. You are going to spend the rest of your pathetic life in a prison cell for what you have done tonight." I stood perfectly still, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, while 372 members of the supposed elite watched my own mother attempt the greatest financial extortion of her life. She had just commandeered the microphone at my younger sister's lavish wedding reception to demand the keys to my $15 million Manhattan penthouse. She told a room full of arrogant strangers that I was a bitter and single woman who needed to surrender my hard-earned home so her favorite daughter could maintain a fake high society lifestyle. When I looked her dead in the eyes and publicly refused, her face twisted into a mask of pure unhinged rage. She marched off that stage ready to deliver a blow that would shatter our family forever. "My name is Aaliyah, and I am a 29-year-old hedge fund manager. I spent the last decade building an impenetrable fortress of wealth, specifically to protect myself from the toxic woman who gave birth to me. I always knew a day of reckoning would come, but I never expected it to happen under the glittering chandeliers of a five-star hotel ballroom." The air inside the reception hall was thick with the overwhelming scent of imported white roses and desperate social climbing. My sister Jasmine was marrying Preston, a man whose entire personality revolved around his claim to old money Boston heritage. From the very second Preston placed that engagement ring on Jasmine's finger, my mother Yvonne had completely lost her mind. She viewed this wedding not as a celebration of love, but as a hostile corporate takeover. To Yvonne, this marriage was her ultimate golden ticket into the exclusive white aristocratic circles she had blindly worshipped her entire life. She spent the evening practically begging for the approval of Preston's wealthy relatives, laughing entirely too loud at their mediocre jokes and completely ignoring the subtle condescension in their eyes. I sat alone at a table near the back of the room, observing the entire pathetic performance, with the surgical detachment required in my line of work. Managing multi-million-dollar portfolios teaches you how to quickly identify a bad investment. Preston was the worst kind of fraud. I could see the truth in the slight fraying at the cuffs of his rented tuxedo and the anxious way he constantly monitored the open bar to see how much premium liquor was being consumed. But my mother was far too intoxicated by her own desperate ambition to notice the glaring red flags waving right in front of her face. She was completely focused on impressing a room full of people who would never truly see her as an equal. The live jazz band was flowing through a smooth and elegant melody when a sudden and piercing screech of microphone feedback tore through the cavernous ballroom. Several guests winced and covered their ears in discomfort. I looked toward the main stage and saw my mother standing front and center. Her custom silk designer dress caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers above her head, making her look like a shimmering beacon of vanity. She tapped the microphone twice with her manicured fingernails, demanding absolute silence from the 372 guests in attendance. Her face was flushed with expensive champagne and a sickening sense of triumph. She began a long and rambling speech about the supreme importance of family legacy and the beautiful merging of two highly prestigious bloodlines. I shifted in my chair, feeling a deep sense of unease settle into my bones. I knew my mother never took a public stage unless she had a meticulously planned trap waiting to be sprung. She spoke at length about Jasmine, painting her as the perfect, obedient, and flawless daughter who deserved the absolute best the world could possibly offer. Then her eyes swept across the vast room and locked dead onto me. The temperature in this ballroom seemed to instantly plummet. She smiled a cold and calculating smile that I recognized from the darkest moments of my childhood. She raised her glass and spoke directly to me, projecting her voice through the towering speakers so no one could miss a single syllable. "We all know that a strong marriage requires a proper and solid foundation," she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and marble pillars. "Jasmine and Preston are starting a magnificent new chapter together, and they desperately need a home that truly reflects their elevated social standing. A mediocre starter home simply will not do for a couple of their extraordinary caliber." She paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out to build the dramatic tension she craved. "That is exactly why I am so incredibly thrilled to announce tonight that Aaliyah has generously decided to gift the newlyweds the keys to her penthouse in Manhattan." The entire room went completely still. I sat frozen in my seat, my hand hovering over my water glass as the sheer audacity of her words washed over me. My mother continued, her voice dripping with artificial and suffocating sweetness. "Aaliyah is single and terribly selfish with her corporate career, so she certainly does not need all that luxurious space to herself. Family must always take care of family. Alia knows how absolutely vital it is for Jasmine to live in a prestigious neighborhood that meets the high expectations of Preston and his wonderful parents." The ballroom suddenly erupted into polite applause and excited murmurs. 372 pairs of eyes pivoted away from the stage and stared directly at my table in the back corner. The public ambush left me momentarily speechless. My mother had carefully chosen a setting filled with high society connections to corner me without any means of escape. She calculated that the immense social pressure of being the supportive older sister would force me to cave and publicly hand over a property I had sacrificed my entire youth to purchase. She wanted to use my hard-earned wealth to buy her way into the favor of Preston and his supposedly elite family. The applause slowly faded as the massive crowd waited for my reaction. Jasmine stood near the front row, beaming with absolute and unearned entitlement, her hands clasped together in fake gratitude. Preston stood right beside her, wearing a smug and arrogant smirk that confirmed he was fully aware of this entire extortion scheme from the very beginning. I slowly lowered my hand and pushed my chair back against the thick carpet. I stood up, feeling the heavy and suffocating weight of expectant stares bearing down on my shoulders. I did not raise my voice or let a single ounce of panic show on my face. I looked directly at my mother and spoke loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, knowing the whispers would carry my words to the front of the room. "No." The single word sliced through the lingering applause like a sharpened steel blade. The resulting silence was absolute and completely terrifying. My mother lowered the microphone, her triumphant smile freezing into a rigid and ugly grimace. "I beg your pardon," she asked, her tone shifting instantly from celebratory to a dangerous and venomous warning. I said no. I repeated, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my voice perfectly steady. "I am not giving my $15 million home to a grown woman who refuses to work and a man who pretends to possess infinite wealth." I turned my attention away from my mother and focused entirely on Preston, ensuring my voice carried clearly across the quiet space. "If your family is as rich and powerful as you have been bragging about all evening, Preston, why exactly are you begging a black woman for free real estate? If you cannot afford to buy your own wife a house, you have absolutely no business marrying her." A collective gasp rose from the wealthy audience. Several of Preston's relatives turned a furious shade of red, while others whispered frantically among themselves. Preston dropped his smug smile instantly as his face twisted with pure defensive anger. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides as the facade of his old money superiority began to crack under the weight of my public scrutiny. My mother practically threw the microphone onto the wooden stage and marched down the steps. Her heels clicked violently against the marble floor as she closed the distance between us, her face contorting with a murderous rage that promised absolute destruction. Preston stood frozen, waiting for an answer that Calvin was completely unable to provide. The disgraced patriarch remained pinned to the wooden floor by the private investigators, squeezing his eyes shut as the reality of his impending federal prison sentence washed over him. He refused to look at the terrified white groom, who was currently demanding an explanation for the $5 million sitting in his offshore bank accounts. Desmond adjusted his suit jacket and walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, looking down at Preston with a cold and calculating gaze. "I can answer that question for you, Preston," Desmond said, his voice projecting effortlessly across the silent ballroom. He pulled a thick stack of bank transfer records from his leather briefcase and held them up for the crowd to see. "The money your family firm received last Tuesday did not come from the Caldwell Family Trust. It did not come from Calvin personal savings or Yvonne's social club accounts. That $5 million was carefully extracted from a heavily monitored corporate holding account belonging entirely to my client, Aaliyah." Preston took a shaky step backward, his expensive shoes scraping loudly against the marble tiles. He shook his head in frantic denial, refusing to accept the massive legal danger he had just been dragged into. "That is impossible," Preston stammered, his voice pitching higher with every word. "Yvonne told me the funds were a personal gift from her private estate. She signed the transfer authorization herself." Desmond let out a dark chuckle that sent a visible shiver down Preston's spine. "Yvonne did sign the authorization," Desmond confirmed. "She used forged access codes to break into what she mistakenly believed was Calvin's active business account. But Calvin Business went bankrupt 6 weeks ago, and Aaliyah Hedge Fund bought out all the remaining corporate debt. When Yvonne executed that wire transfer, she was actively stealing corporate funds directly from a federal financial institution. She committed a massive felony, and you gladly provided the getaway vehicle for the stolen cash." My mother let out a horrific wail from the floor, scrambling away from the shattered champagne glass and looking up at me with wild, terrified eyes. "You knew," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. "You knew I was taking the money, and you let me do it. You deliberately set me up to fail." I looked down at the woman who had slapped me across the face less than an hour ago. I kept my expression entirely blank, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the monster who had tormented me my entire life. "I did not set you up, Yvonne," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I simply stopped protecting you from your own insatiable greed. I knew about your forged will for over 6 months. My financial team flagged the discrepancies in the estate documents the very same day I bought out Calvin Failing Construction Company. I could have easily locked the accounts and prevented you from taking a single penny. But I knew that if I blocked the transfer, you would simply find another way to manipulate Jasmine and steal from someone else to fund this pathetic high society charade." I took a slow step forward, making sure every single guest in the ballroom could hear my next words. "I wanted to see exactly how far you were willing to go to buy your way into a racist aristocratic family," I explained, staring directly into her panicked eyes. "I removed the security flags on that specific holding account. I watched the financial monitors in real time as you desperately typed in the forged authorization codes. I sat in my office and let you initiate the transfer. I watched you steal $5 million of my money just so you could impress a man who despises our very existence." My mother covered her face with her hands, sobbing violently as the brilliant architecture of my trap finally became clear to her. "You wired stolen corporate funds across state lines and directly into an offshore account," I continued, spelling out the exact nature of her impending doom. "You did not just commit simple theft, Yvonne. By crossing state borders and utilizing digital financial networks, you triggered a massive federal wire fraud investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been monitoring this entire wedding reception for the last 45 minutes. Preston began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest as he stumbled backward into a heavily decorated dinner table. The tall floral centerpiece wobbled dangerously before crashing onto the floor, sending water and white roses spilling across the expensive shoes of the terrified guests. "I had nothing to do with this," Preston yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. "I did not know the money was stolen. I thought it was a legitimate family gift. I am completely innocent." I turned my cold gaze toward the cowardly groom, watching his entire fake old money persona shatter into a million pieces. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense when you are sitting on $5 million of stolen federal funds. Preston, I told him, crossing my arms over my chest. "You actively provided the offshore routing numbers. You signed the receiving documents to bypass the standard holding periods. You used the stolen cash to pay off your family massive bankruptcy debts and secure the lease on your new luxury vehicles. You are not an innocent bystander. You are a direct accomplice to federal wire fraud and money laundering." Jasmine remained on the floor sobbing into her ruined silk wedding dress, completely incapable of processing the immense legal and financial destruction happening around her. She had spent her entire life being shielded from consequence, relying entirely on my mother to pave her way with stolen money and fake prestige. Now she was sitting in a puddle of spilled water and crushed roses with absolutely no money, no legacy, and a husband who was about to be indicted by the federal government. The 372 elite guests remained entirely paralyzed by the unfolding tragedy. Nobody dared to speak or move a single muscle. They simply clutched their designer purses and stared in absolute horror as the golden family they had admired was brutally dismantled in real time. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was broken only by the pathetic sound of my mother weeping and my father groaning in pain from the wooden stage. Desmond stepped forward to deliver the final blow. The federal authorities have already frozen every single account associated with the Caldwell family and the Preston investment firm, Desmond announced to the silent room. There is absolutely no financial escape route left. Every credit card, every offshore holding, every hidden asset has been completely seized, pending the federal criminal investigation. You have absolutely nothing left. The overwhelming reality of their total destruction settled over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The perfect high society wedding had become the site of a massive federal takedown, and I had orchestrated every single second of it. I stood tall in the center of the ballroom, feeling an incredible sense of peace wash over my body. The years of emotional abuse, financial theft, and constant degradation had finally been paid back in full. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted near the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. The sea of wealthy guests parted quickly as a short, red-faced man wearing a tight hotel management suit pushed his way through the crowd. He was sweating profusely, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of anger and absolute panic. He marched directly down the center aisle, completely ignoring the heavy tension and the armed private investigators standing on the main stage. The hotel manager stopped a few feet away from where I stood, holding a very long and very urgent paper receipt that trailed down toward the marble floor. He looked frantically between my sobbing mother on the floor and my father, who was still pinned to the stage. "Excuse me," the manager shouted, his voice trembling with furious anxiety as he waved the massive receipt in the air. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge of this event right now." The short, red-faced hotel manager pushed his way to the very front of the stage. He was gripping a massive strip of receipt paper that curled down and brushed against his polished leather shoes. The crowd of wealthy elite guests had already been paralyzed by the shocking revelations of wire fraud, but this new disruption pulled everyone's attention immediately to the frantic man in the tailored hospitality suit. He marched straight up to my father Calvin with absolute panic sweating from his forehead. "Excuse me, sir," the manager said, his voice projecting a frantic tone that was rapidly losing its polite filter. "I need to speak with you regarding the master account for this wedding reception." Calvin was still trying to recover his breath after being restrained by the investigators. He glared at the manager with pure venom, completely offended that an employee would dare interrupt him. "What is the meaning of this?" Calvin barked, wiping a smear of blood from his chin. "Can you not see we are dealing with a severe family matter right now? Get back to your office and I will deal with you later." The hotel manager did not back down an inch. He held up the incredibly long receipt paper and shook it. "I am afraid this cannot wait another second, sir," the manager insisted, his voice raising in volume. "The primary credit account placed on hold for tonight's event has just been flagged and entirely frozen by the issuing bank. We attempted to run the final authorization for the $350,000 catering and venue balance, but the transaction was violently rejected. My financial department just received an alert stating the account is locked under suspicion of insolvency." A loud murmur rippled through the hundreds of wealthy guests. The idea of a declined credit card at a high society function was the ultimate social sin. Calvin's face flushed a deep and embarrassed shade of crimson. He scrambled to his feet, brushing off his expensive suit jacket with trembling hands. "It is obviously a pathetic bank error, you incompetent fool," Calvin spat, reaching frantically into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a thick designer leather wallet and aggressively pulled out 3 separate heavy metal black credit cards. "These are limitless corporate accounts," Calvin declared loudly. "Run every single one of them right now." The manager pulled a sleek mobile payment terminal from his pocket. He snatched the first metal card from Calvin's hand and swiped it. The terminal beeped a harsh and immediate red declining tone. Calvin swallowed hard, his eyes widening. The manager swiped the second card. Another harsh red beep echoed through the quiet room. The manager swiped the third and final black card. The screen flashed the exact same red error message indicating a complete financial freeze. "Every single card is completely dead," the manager announced, his tone shifting from frantic to outright hostile. "You have absolutely no available credit remaining on any of these accounts." I stepped forward, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor as I closed the distance between myself and the panicked hotel manager. "Do not bother running those cards again," I told the manager, keeping my voice calm. "The accounts are completely empty and permanently locked." Calvin whipped his head around to stare at me, his chest heaving with disbelief. "What have you done to my accounts?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "You have no authorization to touch my personal banking." I smiled a cold and surgical smile. "I do not need your authorization when I own the entire banking institution that holds your pathetic debts," Calvin, I explained, laying out the trap I had built. "I told you 10 minutes ago that my hedge fund anonymously bought out your failing company. What I did not tell you is that I also purchased the underlying debt portfolios of your personal credit lines yesterday afternoon." I walked slowly around the ruined wedding cake on the floor, letting my words sink into his terrified mind. "When I was sitting in the back of my car exactly 1 hour ago, I did not just call Desmond to bring the true will," I continued, pointing a finger at his chest. "I authorized my chief operations officer to execute a complete financial lockdown on every single asset bearing your name. Those black cards you are waving around are completely useless pieces of metal. I froze your primary accounts. I liquidated your stock portfolios to cover your outstanding corporate debts. I canceled your credit lines, and I revoked your access to the business expense accounts you have been using to fund this charade of a lifestyle. You are standing in a rented tuxedo, throwing a $350,000 party with money that officially belongs to my corporation." Jasmine let out another horrific wail from the floor, clutching her ruined gown. "My mother." Yvonne crawled toward Calvin, looking up at him with pure terror. "Tell her to turn the cards back on," Yvonne pleaded, digging her nails into his jacket. "Tell her to fix this, Calvin. We cannot be embarrassed like this in front of the entire country club." Calvin looked completely hollowed out, his arrogant posture broken by the staggering weight of his financial ruin. He had spent his entire life bullying his own daughter, and now that very same daughter held his entire existence in the palm of her hand. The hotel manager ripped the 3 dead metal credit cards from the terminal and threw them aggressively onto the floor right at Calvin's feet. The clatter of the cards hitting the marble sounded like final nails being driven into the coffin of their fake upper-class reality. The manager's face turned bright red as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my parents. "I do not care about your family drama or your corporate takeovers," the manager shouted, his voice echoing violently through the ballroom. "I have $350,000 worth of premium catering, open bar tabs, and ballroom rental fees that have zero financial backing. I am giving you exactly 5 minutes to produce a valid wire transfer or a certified cashier check for the entire outstanding balance." The manager signaled to the remaining hotel staff standing near the perimeter of the room. "Lock every single exit immediately," he ordered his staff. "Nobody leaves this ballroom. If I do not see the money in 5 minutes, I am locking the doors, trapping you all inside, and pressing immediate felony charges for theft of services and hospitality fraud." The hotel manager was still shouting about locking the heavy ballroom doors and pressing immediate felony charges for theft of services when my mother realized her situation was completely hopeless. Yvonne looked around the massive room, taking in the horrified faces of the wealthy elite guests and the absolute destruction of her carefully manufactured social standing. She understood that anger and threats would no longer save her from the devastating reality I had just unleashed upon her. She seamlessly transitioned into the absolute last weapon she had left in her pathetic arsenal. Yvonne let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob and dropped heavily onto her knees right in front of where I stood. She ignored the sharp pieces of broken champagne glass scattered across the marble floor and the spilled water soaking into the hem of her expensive custom silk dress. She clasped her hands together, holding them up toward me, as heavy tears began streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "Alia, please, you have to listen to me," Yvonne cried, her voice trembling with a perfectly executed and desperate sorrow. "You simply do not understand why I did the things I did to you. You stand there thinking I was just being cruel and vindictive, but I was actually trying to protect you." She crawled a few inches closer, her voice dropping into a raspy theatrical whisper, designed specifically to draw maximum sympathy from the silent crowd of guests watching our every move. The world out there is so incredibly unforgiving and cold, especially to women who look like us. I had to be hard on you, Alia. I had to push you far beyond your breaking point because I knew society would try to break you anyway. I stole that college tuition money because I needed you to learn how to survive when the safety net was suddenly gone. I needed you to build your own impenetrable armor. She reached out and tried to grab the fabric of my dress, but I took a deliberate step backward, leaving her grasping at empty air. Everything I did was to ensure this family survived in a harsh, white-dominated world. Yvonne continued weaving her toxic and manipulative narrative. I wanted to elevate us, so we would never have to struggle or be looked down upon ever again. I wanted to give you and Jasmine a permanent seat at the tables where the real power is held. You have to forgive me, Alia, because all of my harsh actions were born from a deep motherly love and a desperate desire to see you become a strong and resilient black woman. I stood perfectly still and watched her weep on the cold floor. A decade ago, that exact speech would have completely broken my heart and sent me running to comfort her. I would have internalized her toxic gaslighting and blamed myself for not understanding her profound and difficult maternal sacrifices. But I was no longer a frightened 18-year-old girl desperate for her mother to show her an ounce of affection. I was a 29-year-old hedge fund manager who had built a massive empire from the ground up while carrying the heavy scars of her relentless psychological warfare. I looked down at her tear-stained face and felt absolutely nothing but a cold and surgical detachment. She was not a struggling mother doing her best. She was a parasite trying to use historical trauma as a convenient shield for her own personal greed. You are putting on a truly magnificent performance, Yvonne, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of any emotion. But we both know that every single word falling out of your mouth right now is a complete and utter lie. You did not abuse me to make me strong. You did not steal my future to teach me how to survive. You are trying to hide your pathetic financial crimes behind the very real struggles of hardworking black mothers, and it is the most disgusting thing you have done all evening. I took a slow step forward, forcing her to look up at my face. You did not push me to succeed so I could overcome systemic hurdles. You stole from me because you are deeply insecure and you wanted to buy a racist husband for your favorite golden child. You want to know the real reason you made my life a living nightmare? I asked, watching her eyes dart nervously around the quiet ballroom. It has absolutely nothing to do with tough love or preparing me for the harsh realities of the corporate world. You abused me because every single time you look at me, you see Grandma Ruby staring right back at you. The guests murmured as the heavy truth hung in the air. You hated Ruby because she was an authentic and powerful woman who built real generational wealth without ever compromising her dignity or erasing her roots. Ruby saw right through your desperate and shallow social climbing. She knew you were just a vain, empty shell obsessed with expensive labels and fake country club memberships. And because I share her exact face and her unyielding spirit, you decided to punish me for every single ounce of inadequacy you felt when you stood in her presence. Do not dare kneel there and tell me you did this to elevate our family in a white-dominated world, I said, my voice rising just enough to command the attention of the entire hotel ballroom. You did not fight against the oppressive system, Yvonne. You actively and willingly funded it. You embezzled $5 million of corporate funds to pay off the massive bankruptcy debts of a racist white family, just so you could take pictures at their exclusive events and pretend you were one of them. You literally sold out your own blood and financed the very people who looked down on you just to secure a fake plastic seat at a white country club. You traded your dignity and your daughter future for a social status that was paid for entirely with stolen money. My mother remained on her knees, completely paralyzed by the sheer blunt force of my words. The fake theatrical tears stopped falling instantly as she realized her ultimate emotional manipulation tactic had completely failed to penetrate my armor. She opened her mouth to argue, but absolutely no sound came out of her throat. She looked over at Calvin, who was still pinned to the stage floor by the armed investigators, and then at Jasmine, who was sobbing uncontrollably near the ruined wedding cake. She had absolutely no more lies to spin and no more moves to play. I looked down at the pathetic ruins of the people who used to be my family. I opened my designer clutch and reached my hand inside. I pulled out a heavy metal ring holding a final set of keys. I looked down at my mother, who was still kneeling on the cold marble floor, waiting for my response to her pathetic emotional performance. I did not offer her a single ounce of forgiveness or understanding. Instead, I reached my hand deep inside my custom designer clutch, and my fingers wrapped around the heavy cold metal of a large key ring. I pulled my hand out slowly, letting the bright lights of the crystal chandeliers reflect off the jagged brass edges of the keys. These were not just any random keys. They were the master set to the sprawling historical mansion located in the most prestigious neighborhood in the city. This was the very same house where my mother had hosted her lavish charity dinners and exclusive social club meetings for the last 2 decades. It was the ultimate physical symbol of her fake aristocratic status and the primary source of her unearned arrogance. I held the heavy ring of keys high in the air for a brief moment, letting the quiet crowd of 372 elite guests see exactly what I was holding. Then I uncurled my fingers and dropped them. The heavy brass keys hit the floor with a loud, sharp clatter, landing right next to the sharp pieces of broken champagne glass and the crushed white rose petals. The metallic sound echoed through the massive ballroom, sounding like a final gavel strike in a courtroom. "Grandma Ruby House officially belongs to me," I announced, my voice projecting clearly over the heavy silence of the room. "The blind trust has been fully activated, and the title was legally transferred into my name this morning. You and Calvin have exactly 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate my property." My mother stared at the keys lying in the puddle of spilled water as if they were a venomous snake. Her mouth opened and closed, but the sheer shock of being rendered completely homeless by her own daughter left her entirely speechless. Jasmine let out another frantic wail from her spot on the floor, realizing that she no longer even had a childhood bedroom to return to after her spectacular marital failure tonight. I took a deliberate step closer to my mother, ensuring she heard my next specific instruction loud and clear. "When you pack your bags tomorrow morning, you will only take your clothes and your cheap personal items," I instructed, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. "Do not even think about touching the vintage art collection hanging in the main hallway. Do not attempt to pack the antique silver dining sets or the historical artifacts Grandma Ruby spent her entire life collecting. Every single item inside those walls legally belongs to the estate now, and I have already cataloged the entire inventory. If a single painting or silver spoon is missing, when I take possession of the house tomorrow, I will personally add grand larceny to your growing list of federal criminal charges." Calvin let out a furious roar from the wooden stage, where the two armed private investigators still kept him firmly pinned to the floor. He thrashed his heavy shoulders violently against the firm grip of the trained professionals, trying desperately to lift his face away from the polished wood. "You cannot just throw us out onto the street like stray dogs," Calvin shouted, his voice rough and laced with desperate defiance. "I know my legal rights in this state, Aaliyah. You cannot execute a 24-hour eviction without a formal court order. I have established tenant rights and marital property claims on that estate. We can claim squatter rights if we have to. I will force you to take me to civil court, and I will drag this eviction process out for 3 agonizing years. I will make you bleed hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees before I ever let you kick me out of my own home." He was grasping at imaginary legal straws, trying to salvage any tiny shred of power he could find in front of the wealthy guests. He truly believed he could use the slow-moving bureaucratic justice system as a weapon against me, just like he had done to his desperate subcontractors for years. Desmond let out a soft, tired sigh and stepped forward to completely obliterate Calvin's final pathetic delusion. The distinguished lawyer looked down at my father with an expression of pure clinical disgust. Desmond adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pulled a fresh legal document from his heavy leather briefcase. "You are completely misunderstanding the fundamental nature of your current living situation," Calvin Desmond explained, his voice carrying a calm and lethal authority. "Traditional residential tenant rights and squatter protections absolutely do not apply to your specific case. You see, when your construction business began failing miserably 2 years ago, you became desperate for fast liquid cash. You secretly used the family mansion as direct collateral to secure an illegal high-interest shadow loan from an unregulated private lender. You forged Yvonne's signature on the property deed documents, and you bypassed the standard banking regulations to get your hands on that money." Desmond unfolded the thick legal document and held it up for the room to see. Since Ali hedge fund bought out every single one of your corporate and private debts yesterday afternoon, she now owns that specific illegal collateral loan. Desmond continued destroying the last remaining pillar of Calvin fake empire. And because you officially defaulted on your final payment window this morning, this is no longer a standard residential eviction process. This is an immediate commercial foreclosure executed under the Emergency Corporate Recovery Act. You have absolutely no tenant rights to invoke and no civil court delays to hide behind. The local county sheriff will arrive at the property tomorrow night at exactly midnight to physically remove any remaining persons or unapproved luggage from the premises. The brutal finality of the legal explanation hit Calvin like a physical blow to the chest. The aggressive fight completely left his body, and he went entirely limp against the wooden floor of the stage. He finally understood that there were no more loopholes left to exploit, and no more corrupt city officials left to bribe. The multi-million-dollar home he had used to project false wealth and power to the world was gone, and he was going to be thrown out onto the pavement like the common fraud he truly was. The crowd of high society guests began whispering furiously among themselves, absolutely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of the financial execution they were witnessing. While the entire room was focused on the devastating collapse of my parents on the main stage, my eyes caught a subtle and frantic movement near the far corner of the ballroom. Preston, the arrogant groom, had quietly backed away from the center of the conflict. He had listened to the terrifying details about the federal wire fraud and the illegal shadow loans, and his cowardly survival instincts had fully kicked in. He knew the federal authorities were actively tracking the $5 million resting in his offshore accounts, and he wanted absolutely no part of the impending arrests. I watched silently as Preston abandoned his ruined bride and began inching his way toward the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen service exit, desperately hoping to sneak out the back of the hotel and vanish into the night before the consequences of his actions finally caught up to him. I stood in a hotel ballroom, surrounded by nearly 400 members of the elite, when my mother commandeered the microphone and demanded the keys to my $15 million Manhattan penthouse. She told the crowd I was a selfish single woman and my sister needed my home to impress her aristocratic white in-laws. When I looked her dead in the eye and publicly refused, her carefully crafted facade crumbled. My name is Aaliyah, and I am a 29-year-old self-made hedge fund manager. I spent my adult life building an impenetrable fortress of financial security to protect myself from the toxic woman who gave birth to me. I knew a day of reckoning would arrive, but never expected it under the glittering chandeliers of a wedding reception. The air inside the ballroom was thick with the scent of white orchids and desperate social climbing. My sister Jasmine was celebrating her marriage to Preston, a man whose personality revolved entirely around his claim to old money, Boston heritage. From the second Preston placed that engagement ring on Jasmine's finger, my mother Yvonne completely lost her mind. She viewed this wedding as a hostile corporate takeover. To Yvonne, this marriage was her golden ticket into the exclusive white high society circles she had blindly worshipped her entire life. She spent the evening begging for the approval of Preston relatives, laughing too loud at their mediocre jokes. The live jazz band was playing a smooth melody when a piercing screech of microphone feedback tore through the cavernous ballroom. Guests winced, covering their ears. I looked toward the main stage and saw my mother standing front and center. Her custom silk designer dress caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, making her look like a shimmering beacon of vanity. She tapped the microphone twice, demanding absolute silence from the 372 guests in attendance. Her face was flushed with expensive champagne and a sickening sense of triumph. She began a rambling speech about the supreme importance of family legacy and the beautiful merging of two prestigious bloodlines. I shifted in my chair, feeling a deep unease settle into my bones. I knew my mother never took a public stage unless she had a meticulously planned trap waiting to be sprung. She spoke at length about Jasmine, painting her as the perfect obedient daughter who deserved the absolute best the world could offer. Then her eyes swept across the vast room and locked dead onto me. The temperature in the ballroom seemed to plummet. She smiled, a cold, calculating smile that I recognized from the darkest moments of my childhood. She raised her glass and spoke directly to me, projecting her voice through the towering speakers. "We all know that a strong marriage requires a solid foundation," she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Jasmine and Preston are starting a magnificent new chapter together, and they desperately need a home that truly reflects their elevated social standing. She paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out to build dramatic tension. That is exactly why I am so thrilled to announce tonight that Alia has generously decided to gift the newlyweds the keys to her penthouse in Manhattan. The entire room went completely still. I sat frozen in my seat as the sheer audacity of her words washed over me. My mother continued, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Alia is single and terribly selfish with her corporate career, so she certainly does not need all of that luxurious space to herself. Family must always take care of family. Alia knows how vital it is for Jasmine to live in a prestigious neighborhood that meets the high expectations of Preston and his parents. The ballroom erupted into polite applause and excited murmurs. 372 pairs of eyes pivoted away from the stage and stared directly at my table. The public ambush left me momentarily speechless. My mother had chosen a setting filled with high society connections to corner me without any means of escape. She calculated that the immense social pressure of being the supportive older sister would force me to cave and publicly hand over a property I had sacrificed my youth to purchase. She wanted to use my hard-earned wealth to buy her way into the favor of Preston and his elite family. The applause slowly faded as the massive crowd waited for my reaction. Jasmine stood near the front row, beaming with unearned entitlement, her hands clasped together in fake gratitude. Preston stood right beside her, wearing a smug smirk that confirmed he was fully aware of this extortion scheme from the beginning. I slowly lowered my hand and pushed my chair back against the thick carpet. I stood up, feeling the heavy weight of expectant stares bearing down on my shoulders. I did not raise my voice or let a single ounce of panic show on my face. I looked directly at my mother and spoke loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. No. The single word sliced through the lingering applause like a sharpened steel blade. The resulting silence was absolute and completely terrifying. My mother lowered the microphone, her triumphant smile freezing into a rigid grimace. "I beg your pardon," she asked, her tone shifting instantly from celebratory to a dangerous, venomous warning. "I said no," I repeated, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my voice perfectly steady. "I am not giving my $15 million home to a grown woman who refuses to work and a man who pretends to possess infinite wealth." I turned my attention away from my mother and focused entirely on Preston, ensuring my voice carried clearly across the quiet space. "If your family is as rich and powerful as you have been bragging about all evening, Preston, why exactly are you begging a black woman for free real estate? If you cannot afford to buy your own wife a house, you have absolutely no business marrying her." A collective gasp rose from the wealthy audience. Several of Preston's relatives turned a furious shade of red while others whispered frantically. Preston dropped his smug smile instantly as his face twisted with pure defensive anger. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides as the fragile facade of his old money superiority began to completely crack under the heavy weight of my public scrutiny. My mother threw the heavy microphone onto the wooden stage and marched down the steep steps. Her heels clicked violently against the polished marble floor as she closed the distance between us, her face contorting with a murderous rage that promised absolute destruction. The wailing sound of the police sirens grew exponentially louder until the noise completely consumed the grand ballroom. Bright flashes of red and blue emergency lights bounced off the tall glass windows, casting harsh and unforgiving shadows across the terrified faces of the wedding guests. I took a slow sip of my champagne and watched as the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance were pushed open with absolute authority. A team of federal agents stepped into the reception hall wearing dark tactical jackets with the letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. The sheer visual contrast of armed federal authorities marching into a room decorated with imported white orchids and crystal centerpieces was absolutely staggering. Their heavy black boots thudded against the polished marble floor, marching in a synchronized and intimidating rhythm straight toward the main stage where the ruins of my family were currently gathered. Out of the 372 elite guests in attendance, not a single person made a move towards the exits. Instead, a fascinating and entirely predictable social phenomenon occurred. The wealthy aristocrats and high society social climbers, who had spent the entire evening looking down their noses at everyone else, simultaneously reached into their designer purses and tailored suit jackets. Hundreds of smartphones were raised into the air like a glowing digital firing squad. Nobody stepped forward to offer my parents any legal assistance or moral support. They simply pressed record, eager to capture the spectacular and permanent downfall of the Golden family they had secretly despised all along. My mother's ultimate nightmare was unfolding in high definition, and it was about to be broadcast to every single country club and private social circle in the city. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing woman with a strictly professional demeanor, walked directly up to the wooden stage. Desmond stepped forward to meet her, pulling the thick black folder containing all the financial dossiers, forged documents, and offshore wire transfer receipts from his leather briefcase. He handed the damning evidence directly to the federal agent, exchanging a brief and silent nod of mutual understanding. The agent opened the folder, scanning the top page before turning her cold gaze toward the floor where the private investigators were still holding my father. She signaled to her team, and two male agents immediately moved in to take over the physical restraint of Calvin. They hauled his heavy frame off the polished wood, forcing him to stand upright despite his groans of protest. "Calvin, you are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate forgery of legal estate documents," the lead agent announced, her voice echoing clearly across the silent ballroom. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sharp metallic clicking sound of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around my father's wrists sounded like the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. Calvin's face was completely drained of color, his massive ego entirely shattered as he was physically marched off his own stage in front of the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. He did not shout any more empty threats or demand to speak to a lawyer. He simply hung his head in absolute shame, realizing his reign of arrogance was permanently finished. The lead agent then turned her attention toward the center of the dance floor, where my mother was still sitting in a puddle of spilled water and crushed white roses. Yvonne saw the federal authorities advancing toward her, and she completely lost her mind. She scrambled backward across the marble tiles, her expensive silk designer dress tearing against the sharp fragments of broken champagne glass. She held her hands up in front of her face, shaking her head violently from side to side in pure hysterical denial. "No, you cannot do this to me!" Yvonne shrieked, her voice cracking with pure terror as the agents surrounded her. "I am a respected member of this community. I host charity galas. I am the mother of the bride. You are making a terrible mistake. I did not steal anything." The agents did not hesitate or show a single ounce of pity for her pathetic theatrical performance. They grabbed her arms and hauled her to her feet, ignoring her frantic thrashing and desperate pleas for mercy. "Yvonne, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive financial embezzlement, and the illegal transfer of stolen corporate funds across state lines," the agent stated, reading her the Miranda rights as they forcefully pulled her arms behind her back. The second set of steel handcuffs clicked shut, securing her wrists together. The physical reality of the metal binding her hands completely broke what was left of her fragile sanity. She began to hyperventilate, gasping for air, as the devastating weight of a lengthy federal prison sentence finally crushed her delusions of grandeur. Preston had been watching the arrests while standing completely frozen near the service hallway exit. He took a slow, terrified step backward, hoping the agents would somehow overlook his presence in the chaos. But a federal investigation into $5 million of stolen funds does not simply forget the recipient of the stolen cash. Two agents broke away from the main group and marched directly toward the cowardly groom. Preston immediately raised his hands high in the air, surrendering before they even reached him. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of his old money superiority and immediately began attempting to throw my mother under the bus to save his own skin. "I had absolutely no idea the money was stolen," Preston babbled frantically as the agents grabbed his arms and spun him around to face the wall. "Yvonne told me it was a clean family gift. She manipulated me. I am a victim here too. You cannot arrest me. I am from a prestigious Boston family." The agents ignored his pathetic whining and slammed him against the decorative wall paneling. "Preston, you are under federal arrest for the knowing receipt of stolen corporate funds and active participation in international money laundering," the agent told him, locking the tight metal cuffs around his wrists. Preston began to sob openly, tears streaming down his face as he realized his fake aristocratic life was over and he was going to be entirely cut off by his own bankrupt family the second the news hit the press. Jasmine stood near the ruined wedding cake, completely alone, watching her parents and her new husband being read their rights and prepared for transport to a federal holding facility. She looked absolutely hollowed out, a spoiled child who had suddenly lost the parents who shielded her from reality, and the husband who was supposed to elevate her status. She had no money, no skills, and absolutely no idea how to survive in a world where she could not simply demand things be handed to her. My mother suddenly stopped struggling against the agents holding her. She whipped her head around and locked her furious bloodshot eyes directly onto me. The absolute raw hatred radiating from her gaze was palpable. She realized that I had orchestrated every single second of this flawless execution, and that I was standing there completely untouched by the destruction. Aaliyah Yvonne screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice raw and jagged with fury. "You did this to your own family. You set us up to be slaughtered. You are a cold-hearted monster, and I curse the day you were born. You are going to burn in hell for destroying your sister life and sending your own parents to prison. I curse you." I handed my empty champagne glass to a passing waiter who was standing frozen near the edge of the room. I smoothed the fabric of my dress and began walking slowly and deliberately toward the center of the dance floor. The federal agents paused their march toward the exit, allowing me to close the distance between myself and the woman who had tormented me for almost 3 decades. I stopped exactly 1 foot away from my mother, looking down at her tear-stained face and her handcuffed wrists. She glared up at me, her chest heaving with desperate anger, waiting for me to respond to her venomous curses. I leaned forward, bridging the small gap between us. I kept my expression entirely neutral and lowered my voice to a dangerous whisper that only she could hear over the chaotic noise of the ballroom. I leaned forward, bridging the small gap between us. I kept my expression entirely neutral and lowered my voice to a dangerous whisper that only she could hear over the chaotic noise of the ballroom. I looked deeply into the terrified eyes of the woman who had spent nearly 3 decades trying to break my spirit and crush my independence. "You spent your entire life chasing an illusion of power," I told her, watching the heavy tears carve distinct tracks through her expensive foundation. "You sacrificed your own flesh and blood just to build a fragile house of cards, and now you get to watch it burn to the ground right in front of the very people you desperately wanted to impress." "I am Grandma Ruby Legacy," I whispered, delivering the absolute final blow to her shattered ego. "You are just a cautionary tale." My mother let out a strangled, pathetic gasp as the brutal truth of my words finally broke through her thick layers of absolute delusion. The federal agents did not give her another second to process her spectacular downfall. They pulled her roughly to her feet, completely ignoring her sudden physical weakness and her hysterical sobbing. I took a deliberate step backward and watched with supreme satisfaction as the armed authorities marched her toward the heavy mahogany doors. Calvin was dragged right behind her, his head hanging in total disgrace as he shuffled past the very same wealthy guests he had been trying to impress all evening. Preston was the last to be hauled away, weeping openly and pleading with the stoic officers about his fake old money status. The three of them were paraded out of the grand ballroom under the blinding flashes of hundreds of smartphone cameras. The flashing red and blue emergency lights from the police cruisers parked outside reflected off the massive crystal chandeliers, creating a dizzying and chaotic strobe effect across the vaulted ceilings. Their social execution was permanently documented, and their fraudulent empire was officially dead. With the criminals finally removed from the premises, the heavy, suffocating tension in the room began to slowly shift into a profound and awkward disbelief. The vast sea of elite guests remained entirely paralyzed, unsure of what to do, now that the elegant wedding reception had turned into a massive federal crime scene. I turned my attention away from the main exit and looked down at the center of the polished marble dance floor. There, sitting completely alone, amidst the absolute wreckage of her fairy tale evening, was Jasmine. My younger sister looked like a discarded and broken porcelain doll. Her $20,000 custom silk wedding dress was entirely ruined, soaked with spilled ice water and smeared with the crushed white roses from the shattered centerpieces. Her perfectly styled hair had fallen out of its expensive updo, hanging in messy damp tangles around her face. The heavy, dramatic makeup she had applied to look like a wealthy, aristocratic bride was now running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. She had no rich white husband to elevate her social status. She had no wealthy parents to fund her endless vanity projects. She had no fake trust fund to rely on, and absolutely no real-world skills to fall back on. She was a 25-year-old woman who had never worked a single day in her entire life, and suddenly she had absolutely nothing left to her name. Jasmine slowly looked up at me, her eyes wide with a profound and crippling terror as the permanent reality of her new poverty set in. The arrogant entitlement she had displayed just an hour ago when she was waiting for me to hand over the keys to my penthouse had completely evaporated. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp fragments of broken champagne glass scattered across the marble tiles. "Alia, please," Jasmine wept, her voice cracking with pure pathetic desperation as she looked up at my face. "You cannot just leave me here like this. You have to help me right now. I do not have anywhere to go. Mom and Dad are going to a federal prison and Preston completely abandoned me. I do not have any money, and the bank is going to take the family mansion tomorrow." She reached out a trembling hand toward the hem of my tailored dress, but stopped herself before making contact, knowing I would not tolerate it. "We are sisters," Alia, Jasmine pleaded, attempting to use the very same familial loyalty she had mocked her entire life. "You have that massive penthouse in Manhattan. It has so many empty bedrooms. Please just let me stay with you for a few nights until I can figure out what to do. I promise I will not be a burden. You cannot just throw your own sister out onto the street." I stared down at the weeping bride, feeling absolutely no warmth or sympathy in my heart. Her sudden, desperate appeal to sisterhood was nothing but a blatant manipulation tactic born from pure survival instinct. I remembered exactly how she had treated me when our positions were reversed. I remember when I was 18 years old, sleeping in the back seat of a freezing car because Mom stole my college tuition. I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of any mercy. "I remember calling you and begging you to let me sleep on the floor of your bedroom just for one night so I would not freeze to death. Do you remember what you told me, Jasmine?" She flinched and squeezed her eyes shut, unable to face the ugly reality of her own past cruelty. "You laughed at me," I reminded her, refusing to let her escape the truth. "You told me that losers who drop out of college do not deserve to sleep in a warm house. You told me to figure it out myself, because my poverty was embarrassing you in front of your shallow high school friends. You sat in a brand new luxury vehicle paid for with my stolen money and you left me to starve." I reached into my custom designer clutch and pulled out my leather wallet. I did not pull out a black metal credit card or a shiny set of penthouse keys. I slowly extracted a single crisp $20 bill. I let it slip from my fingers and watched it flutter down through the air until it landed softly against the ruined wet silk of her expensive wedding gown. "You are 25 years old, Jasmine," I told her, my voice echoing with absolute finality over the quiet crowd. "It is time for you to learn how the real world actually works when you do not have stolen money to pave your way. Take that $20, call a cheap taxi, and go get yourself a minimum wage job." I closed my clutch with a sharp metallic snap. I turned away from the sobbing bride and looked at Desmond, who was standing quietly nearby with his heavy leather briefcase. The brilliant lawyer adjusted his glasses and offered me a small, respectful nod, acknowledging the complete and total victory we had achieved tonight. Without another word, we turned our backs on the crying woman and the hundreds of stunned high society guests. Desmond and I walked side by side down the long center aisle of the ballroom, our footsteps moving in perfect synchronized rhythm as we left the absolute chaos completely behind us. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand reception hall loomed ahead of us, standing wide open like a portal to my new life. I did not look over my shoulder even once as the frantic wailing of my sister echoed against the marble walls. We stepped over the threshold and walked out into the quiet luxury of the hotel corridor, leaving the suffocating stench of broken vanity and shattered illusions locked away inside forever. The downfall of Alia's family. In this narrative serves as a brutal yet profound lesson about the intersection of financial independence, authentic self-worth, and the toxicity of social climbing. At its core, the story illustrates that when one's identity is built on the shifting sands of superficial status and greed, the entire structure is destined to collapse the moment the truth is introduced. The primary lesson is that financial autonomy is not merely about accumulating wealth, it is about creating a fortress that protects one's sanity and dignity. Aaliyah's ability to dismantle her family's deception was not an act of spontaneous rage, but the result of years of disciplined, independent success. Because she secured her own future, she was able to set a hard boundary when her mother and sister attempted to commodify her life for their social gain. The story teaches us that we do not owe our peace, our assets, or our future to family members, no matter their biological connection, if those relationships are rooted in theft and exploitation. Furthermore, The story exposes the tragic emptiness of performative status. Characters like Yvonne and Preston were obsessed with the idea of wealth, prestige, and old money heritage. They believed that by wearing the right clothes and associating with the right people, they could transcend their own internal inadequacies. However, their reliance on manipulation and theft proved that their social standing was a hollow facade. When you build your life on the desire to impress people who do not actually value you, you lose your sense of self. Preston's eventual exposure as a con artist and Yvonne's descent into public humiliation highlight that you cannot buy genuine respect or a stable foundation through deceit. Ultimately, Alia's journey reminds us that true empowerment comes from knowing your own value independent of external validation. By refusing to play the role of the sacrificial daughter, she reclaimed her autonomy. The most difficult but necessary lesson is realizing that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is walking away from the people who were supposed to support you, especially when they view you as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. When you prioritize your integrity over the desire to keep the peace, you might lose a toxic connection, but you gain yourself in the process. Reflect on your own circle today. Are you truly building your future? Or are you still funding someone else's dysfunction?